Hey guys, tonight we're boarding a flight to one of the most absurd, most glamorized and most quietly brutal eras in aviation history, the golden age of air travel, and specifically, the women who made it run, not the pilots, not the executives sipping scotch in first class. The flight attendants, the ones who served the drinks, absorbed the compliments, endured the groping, smiled through the turbulence, and somehow did it all while wearing a girdle. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a very warm thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and honestly, you've done the rest of us a real service. Comments like yours are what shape this channel, and I mean that. If you're listening on Spotify, the link is in the description. We're there now, so feel free to migrate. Now, dim those lights, put on a fan for some soft white noise, and get yourself horizontal. Maybe fluff a pillow, straighten your blanket. You won't need to do it perfectly. No one's checking your posture tonight. Let's pause for just a moment, because before we go any further, have you ever stopped to wonder what it was actually like to be a flight attendant in the 1960s? What exactly were the rules? Were you really weighed before every shift? Could you actually be fired for getting married? What happened if your lipstick was the wrong shade of coral? Did airlines genuinely have an opinion about your ankles? And if you turned 30-30, was that just it? Career over? Orthopedic shoes? And early retirement? Could you survive an entire flight on 4 hours of sleep, a regulation smile, and a ham sandwich you weren't allowed to eat in front of passengers? And what on earth was the point of the white glove inspection? And now, congratulations. You've just clocked in for your first shift. The year is 1963. You are 22 years old. You are exactly 5 feet 5.5 inches tall. Your weight has been approved. Your hair has been approved. Your nail polish has been approved. Your smile, forced, perfected, non-negotiable, has been approved. The jet engines are humming on the tarmac. 200 passengers are about to board, and your supervisor is already watching your posture. Welcome to the skies. It only gets stranger from here. Before you ever set foot on an aircraft, the airline had opinions about your face. The application process for flight attendants in the 1960s was less of a job interview and more of a beauty pageant crossed with a military physical, with a little light humiliation sprinkled in for texture. Airlines reviewed photographs alongside resumes. They had preferred eye colors. They had hair length guidelines. Some carriers openly specified that applicants should be attractive and personable, which, when translated from corporate 1960s into plain English, meant pretty enough that the male passengers don't complain, and agreeable enough that they never will. You weren't just applying for a job. You were auditioning for a very specific type of person that you may or may not have actually been. The photograph requirement alone tells you everything you need to know. While men applying for office jobs in the same era were handing over typed resumes and shaking hands, you were submitting a headshot. A full-length photo was sometimes requested. The angle had to be flattering. The expression had to be pleasant. Too serious, and you seemed cold. Too cheerful, and you seemed unstable. You were aiming for a very particular register of warmth, the visual equivalent of a firm handshake and a cashmere sweater, a tall order for a photograph taken in a shopping centre studio on a Tuesday afternoon. Then came the interview itself. If your photograph cleared the first round, and not all of them did, you were invited in to be assessed in person. Airlines trained their recruiters to evaluate candidates on posture the moment they walked through the door. Did you glide? Did you slouch? Were your shoulders back? Was your handshake appropriately confident without being aggressive? Were your shoes sensible but not dowdy? Modern job candidates worry about their LinkedIn profiles. You were worried about the angle of your chin. The interviews covered the expected questions. Why do you want this job? Where do you see yourself in 5 years? But they also veered into territory that would cause any contemporary HR department to immediately call their lawyers. Interviewers asked about your romantic situation. They asked whether you planned to marry. They asked about your relationship with authority, which was a polite way of asking whether you planned to have opinions. Some interviewers asked candidates to walk across the room and back, so they could observe the gate. Some asked them to sit down and stand up. It was a cattle call dressed up in corporate language, and everyone in the room understood it. Height requirements added another layer of specificity. Most airlines had a range, typically between 5'2" and 5'9", because anything outside those parameters was considered visually incongruous with the aircraft environment. Too short, and you couldn't reach the overhead compartments. Too tall, and you'd bang your head on the galley ceiling. These were practical concerns. But the precision with which they were applied, and the fact that they eliminated candidates who were otherwise entirely qualified, says something about an industry that had confused uniformity with standards. And if you made it past the photograph, the interview, the posture assessment, the gait evaluation, the height check, and the preliminary personality screening, you were given a provisional offer, subject to the results of your physical examination, which was scheduled separately, which had its own requirements, which you had not yet been told about in full. You had gotten the job, sort of, conditionally, pending further inspection. Welcome to the industry. Try not to slouch on the way out. Every major airline in the 1960s maintained strict weight limits for their flight attendants, and they enforced them with the casual ruthlessness of a county fair livestock competition. Before every shift, or at regular check-ins, you could be weighed, not metaphorically, literally weighed on an actual scale by an actual supervisor with actual consequences if the number came in wrong. The limits were tied to your height, but they left almost no room for the normal fluctuations of a human body, the kind caused by water, stress, a big lunch, or the fact that your body is alive and doing things on its own schedule. Exceed the limit, and you'd be sent home, suspended, sometimes fired, all for being a normal person in a normal body on a normal Tuesday. The charts were remarkably specific. A woman who was 5'5" was expected to weigh no more than a precise number of pounds, a number that was printed in official documentation and distributed to supervisors with the same matter-of-fact authority as the safety manual. The chart didn't account for muscle mass, bone density, or the fact that human bodies are not standardized products manufactured to a fixed specification. The chart accounted for height and gender, and that was the entirety of the analysis. If your number was wrong, you were wrong, and the remedy was yours to figure out. Airlines gave what they called grace periods, short windows during which an over-limit employee could bring her weight back into compliance before formal disciplinary action began. These grace periods were typically 2 weeks. 2 weeks to lose whatever the chart determined was excess, in a body that was working long shifts, sleeping erratically, eating on the fly in airline galleys, and absorbing jet lag as a professional hazard. Diet pills were not uncommon. Some were prescribed, some were not. Either way, they were part of the routine. The weigh-in itself was not a private affair. It happened in a supervisor's office, or in a back room at the base, with a senior colleague present to record the result. Some women described the experience as clinical, some described it as humiliating. Most described it as something they simply learned to live with, the way you learn to live with anything that happens to you regularly enough to become normal. You stepped on the scale. You waited. The supervisor noted the number. You either went to work or you were sent home to reconsider your lunch habits. What makes this particularly striking is the contrast with every other aspect of the job. You were trusted to manage medical emergencies. You were trusted to conduct emergency evacuations. You were trusted to be the last line of calm between 300 panicking passengers and a very bad situation. But your weight? That required independent verification on a scale by a supervisor before you were permitted to do any of it. The practical effects of the weight policy extended well beyond the workplace. Women described structuring their meals around weigh-in days. They described drinking as little water as possible before check-ins. They described skipping meals on the days before a scheduled assessment, then eating normally afterward, then skipping again as the next one approached. A rhythm of restriction that had nothing to do with health and everything to do with a number on a chart that someone in a suit had decided was the right number for a woman of your height to weigh. It was exhausting. It was constant. And until the 1970s, when legal challenges finally began to dislodge the policy, it was simply the job. In the 1960s, turning 30 as a flight attendant was less of a milestone and more of a termination notice. Most airlines had mandatory retirement ages for cabin crew, and some set that ceiling as low as 32. A few carriers cut it off even earlier. You were expected to vacate the skies before your 30s were properly underway, which is remarkable when you consider that 30 is the age at which most professions assume you've just started to figure out what you're doing. The logic, as far as there was any, seemed to be that flight attendants should be young, fresh-faced, and uncomplicated, because apparently the ability to conduct an emergency evacuation deteriorated somewhere between your 28th and 31st birthdays. The airlines never quite said this plainly. The official language was always more euphemistic, something about career paths and the nature of the position. But the subtext was legible to everyone. The product being sold to passengers was youth, specifically female youth. The flight attendant was meant to be a certain kind of woman, and that kind of woman, in the airline's estimation, had a shelf life. You aged out of the brand the same way a fashion model ages out of a campaign, not because anything had changed about your competence, but because something had changed about the image. What this meant in practice was that the most experienced members of your cabin crew were perpetually being shown the door. Women who had spent 8, 9, 10 years learning the routes, managing difficult passengers, handling emergencies with the specific calm that only comes from having handled them before, these were the women the airline was most eager to replace. In their place came fresh recruits, eager, trained, technically proficient, and completely new. The knowledge that walked out the door with each retiring crew member was not quantified anywhere, because it was not considered a loss. It was considered a refresh. For the women themselves, the age limit created a peculiar professional timeline. You entered the industry in your early 20s. You had perhaps 8 or 9 years to make the most of it. Some women used that window as a launching pad, traveling the world, saving money, building the kind of independence that wasn't always available to women of their generation through other means. Some fell in love with the work itself and found the forced exit brutal. Some had already been pushed out earlier by the marriage ban or the pregnancy rule, making the age limit the third or fourth mechanism by which the industry had tried to remove them. A handful of women challenged the age limits legally, and by the early 1970s, some of those challenges were succeeding. Courts began to find that mandatory retirement ages for flight attendants were discriminatory, that there was no legitimate safety or operational reason to force a competent woman off an aircraft just because she had celebrated a particular birthday. The rulings came slowly, and the airlines contested them energetically, arguing that the age limits were a genuine bona fide occupational requirement. They lost that argument. But losing it in court took years, and in the meantime, thousands of women were retired on schedule, right on time, whether they were ready or not. So, happy birthday. You're 30. The cake is lovely. Clear out your locker before the end of the week. Getting married while working as a flight attendant in the 1960s was, at most airlines, a firing offence. Not an awkward conversation, not a demotion. A firing, effective immediately, no exceptions. The reasoning behind this rule was never entirely explicit, but it didn't need to be. The subtext was as clear as it was insulting. A married woman, the thinking went, belonged at home. She had divided loyalties. She might get pregnant. She might become, horror of horrors, unavailable. Airlines wanted their cabin crew young, unattached, and entirely devoted to the job, which in practice meant entirely available to the whims of passengers and management alike. Some women hid their marriages for years. They wore no rings on the clock, kept their husbands out of conversation, and lived a carefully managed double life just to keep their careers. The ban was enforced through a combination of formal policy and social surveillance. Colleagues sometimes reported engagements to supervisors, not necessarily out of malice, but because the culture of the workplace had normalized the reporting. If management found out you were engaged, you were expected to resign. If they found out you had married without disclosing it, you were terminated. The discovery could come through any number of channels. A change in your legal name on paperwork, a passenger who recognized you from a wedding announcement in the local paper, or simply a supervisor who noticed a tan line where a ring had recently been. The women who hid their marriages developed strategies of impressive logistical complexity. They maintained their maiden names professionally. They removed their wedding rings before arriving at the base. They were careful about which colleagues they confided in, understanding that a secret shared with the wrong person was not a secret at all. Some sustained this arrangement for years, working, traveling, returning home to a husband whose existence the airline officially did not know about. It was a strange double life, conducted at altitude. What makes the marriage ban particularly striking is that it coexisted with a professional culture that was explicitly romantic in its marketing. Airlines in the 1960s sold their cabin crew as aspirational, desirable, available, and then fired those same women for being desired by anyone specific enough to propose. The image and the policy were in direct contradiction, and nobody in airline management appeared to find that especially troubling. Legal challenges to the marriage ban began gaining traction in the mid-1960s, bolstered by the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which included sex as a protected category after significant congressional debate. Flight attendants filed complaints with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, arguing that the marriage ban was straightforward sex discrimination, that no airline applied equivalent restrictions to its male employees, who were permitted to marry, have children, and continue working without consequence. The EEOC agreed, slowly and unevenly. Airlines contested the rulings. Some complied before being forced to. Some had to be dragged. By the early 1970s, the ban was largely gone, dismantled lawsuit by lawsuit, ruling by ruling, by women who had spent their careers working in the gaps of a system designed to exclude them. If marriage was a fireable offense, pregnancy was something else entirely. It didn't even require a formal process. As soon as a flight attendant's pregnancy became visible, or was reported, or was discovered during one of the airline's many intrusive check-ins, she was grounded and let go. There was no maternity leave, no return policy, no conversation about it. The pregnancy simply ended the career, swiftly and without much paperwork. What makes this particularly striking is the clinical efficiency of it, as if the airlines had simply decided that a pregnant body was a logistical problem to be resolved, rather than a human situation to be navigated. The woman who had spent years perfecting the service, learning the routes, managing the chaos of a full cabin, was gone before her second trimester. The policy was in some ways an extension of the marriage ban, a downstream consequence of the same logic. If marriage was incompatible with the job, then its most obvious result was equally incompatible. But pregnancy introduced its own particular dimension because it was harder to hide, impossible to dispute, and carried with it the question of what came next. The answer, for most of the decade, was nothing. There was no next. Pregnancy was a terminal event in an airline career, full stop. Some women were not married when they became pregnant, which created a specific additional layer of difficulty. The rule did not distinguish. Married, unmarried, planned, unplanned, the outcome was the same. The body had changed in a way the airline found incompatible with the position, and the position was terminated accordingly. The woman's circumstances, her preferences, her career investment, none of these were factors in the calculation. What the airlines occasionally offered was the possibility of reapplication after the pregnancy, assuming you met the original criteria, which you might not. Depending on what the pregnancy and its aftermath had done to your weight, your physical condition, or the amount of time that had passed. In practice, this meant that many women who were dismissed for pregnancy never returned to the industry. They had been pushed through a door that did not open from the outside. The physical demands of the job were used, by some airlines, as a justification for the policy. Pregnant women, the argument went, could not safely conduct emergency evacuations. This was not an entirely unreasonable concern, but it was applied with a bluntness that made nuance impossible. There was no assessment of individual capacity. There was no conversation about modified duties during early pregnancy. There was the policy, and there was the door. The policy applied from the moment the pregnancy was known, regardless of how far along it was, regardless of what the woman was physically capable of doing. Pregnancy discrimination protections in American federal law did not arrive until the Pregnancy Discrimination Act of 1978, more than a decade after the period we're discussing. Which means that for the entirety of the 1960s, airlines were doing something that was not merely culturally accepted, but legally permitted. The women who were dismissed during those years had no legal remedy. They had a job, and then they didn't, and the law had nothing to say about it. The absurdity of the situation is matched only by how long it was allowed to continue. Some airlines in the 1960s required flight attendants to wear girdles while on duty, not suggested, required. And to ensure compliance, supervisors were authorized to conduct what were described, with a straight face, as touch checks, physical inspections to confirm that the undergarment was present and correctly worn. Let that settle for a moment. In a professional workplace, in the middle of the 20th century, women were being patted down by supervisors to confirm that they were wearing the approved foundation garment. The stated rationale was something vague about a polished, smooth silhouette. The actual rationale was that airlines had decided, at a granular level, what the bodies of their employees should feel like under their uniforms, and they built enforcement mechanisms around that decision. The girdle itself was a specific garment designed to compress and reshape the lower body, not for the comfort of the wearer, who found it somewhere between mildly restrictive and genuinely painful over the course of a long shift, but for the visual effect it produced beneath a fitted uniform skirt. It smoothed, it controlled. It presented the approved silhouette, that it also made crouching in an aircraft galley significantly more difficult, that it made long periods of standing more taxing, that it compressed internal organs in ways that are not medically recommended during physical labor. These were not considerations that made it into the official policy documentation. The touch check was conducted by a base supervisor before departure. You presented yourself for inspection. The supervisor made contact, a pat on the hip, a check against the lower back, and confirmed the presence of the garment. If the girdle was absent, you were either sent to retrieve one or sent home. Some women kept a spare in their bag specifically for this purpose, putting it on in the bathroom before the inspection and removing it immediately after, which means there existed, in the 1960s airline industry, a small underground economy of women performing a rapid change act in airport restrooms in order to pass a compliance check for a garment they had no intention of actually wearing during the flight. Whether this constitutes ingenuity or the specific desperation of working in a system designed to treat you as a product is a question you can answer for yourself. What is notable about the girdle requirement is the intimacy of its enforcement. Of all the regulations governing flight attendants in this era, the weight limits, the makeup standards, the age caps, this one required physical contact to monitor. It required a supervisor to touch an employee's body in order to assess her compliance with a dress code provision. In any other professional context, this would be understood as deeply inappropriate. In the 1960s airline industry, it was procedure. The girdle requirement quietly disappeared as uniform designs shifted in the late 1960s and early 1970s, not because the airlines had a change of heart, but because fashion moved. Hemlines changed, and the aesthetic the girdle was designed to produce became less central to the brand image. It was not abolished so much as it was simply left behind, replaced by new regulations about new garments. As the industry's opinions about women's bodies continued to evolve, without ever quite becoming less opinioned, flight attendant uniforms in the 1960s were designed by men, approved by men, and worn by women who had very little input into either the design or the approval process. They were structured for appearance first and functioned somewhere around fifth. Skirts were short enough to be stylish but long enough to avoid a scandal, a very precise range that required constant management on staircases, in galley spaces, and during emergency drills. Heels were mandatory on many carriers, even during the boarding process, even on wet tarmacs. even at the end of an 11-hour shift. Hats were required on some airlines until late in the decade. The entire ensemble was essentially a costume designed to signal elegance and approachability while quietly making the job harder at every turn. The heels alone are worth a moment's consideration. Standard issue. Flight attendant heels in the early 1960s were typically between 1 and 2 inches, not enormous by fashion standards, but significant when you factor in the terrain. Aircraft galleys are tight, metallic, and slightly curved underfoot. Aisles are narrow and shift unpredictably during turbulence. Jet bridges were often uneven. Tarmac was frequently wet. And in an emergency, an actual, real emergency, the kind the training had spent weeks preparing you for, you were expected to conduct an evacuation in those heels. Some airlines allowed lower heels for certain phases of the flight. Most required the full uniform, heels included, for boarding, deplaning, and all passenger-facing moments. Airlines brought in notable designers as the decade progressed. Pucci dressed Braniff's crew in a famous sequence of uniforms that generated significant press attention. The designs were striking, colourful, genuinely beautiful in photographs. They were also, depending on which version you were assigned, either extremely warm or extremely cold, difficult to launder, or prone to wrinkling in the pressurized cabin air in ways that could earn you a reprimand during the post-flight inspection. The designer uniform was a PR exercise. You were the mannequin. Uniform changes were announced, not discussed. If the airline decided in October that the approved hat style was changing, you were informed of the new hat, given a timeline for compliance, and expected to present in the correct hat on the specified date. There was no feedback process. There was no pilot program where crew members tried on the new hat and reported whether it stayed on during turbulence. There was the old hat, and then there was the new hat, and the opinion of the person wearing it was not a factor in the transition. What the uniforms did accomplish, in fairness, was a kind of instant legibility. Passengers could identify the crew immediately. The visual coherence of the cabin crew communicated competence and order, which had genuine value in a decade when commercial aviation was still relatively new, and many passengers were still slightly nervous about the whole enterprise. The uniform worked as a symbol of reliability. The person wearing it simply had to manage the gap between the symbol and the reality of working a 12-hour transatlantic flight in a skirt, a girdle, and heels designed for a photo shoot. Airlines in the 1960s did not merely require flight attendants to wear makeup. They specified which makeup. Lipstick had to fall within an approved color range, typically reds, pinks, or corals deemed appropriately feminine, without veering into what management apparently considered provocative territory. Foundation was required. Mascara was expected. Some airlines issued style guides that read like beauty magazines written by legal departments, outlining the correct application of eyeshadow, the appropriate darkness of liner, and the general philosophy of looking effortlessly put together at all times. Showing up barefaced was not an option. Showing up with the wrong shade of lipstick was a disciplinary matter. Your face, in other words, was part of the uniform. The pre-flight check included a makeup assessment. A supervisor would look you over, foundation even, lipstick fresh, mascara not clumped, nothing too dramatic, nothing too subtle, and either approve you for boarding or send you to the restroom to correct whatever the problem was. This check happened before every flight. It happened at 6 in the morning after a red-eye. It happened after a 14-hour layover during which you had slept 4 hours on a hotel pillow that had turned your mascara into abstract art. The standard did not adjust for circumstances. The standard was the standard. Some airlines provided their crew with the approved products directly. A kit issued at the start of employment containing the correct foundation shade, the correct lipstick, the correct mascara. This was presented as a convenience. It was also a control mechanism. If the airline issued the products, there was no ambiguity about what approved looked like. The approved shade of coral was the specific coral in the kit. No substitutions. No personal preferences. The kit was not free. Some airlines deducted the cost from your first paycheck. The logic behind the makeup requirement, insofar as there was logic, was brand consistency. Each flight attendant was a walking ambassador for the airline, and the airline's image required a particular visual standard that extended from the uniform to the face wearing it. Fresh lipstick communicated professionalism. A put-together appearance communicated that this airline took care of the details. The fact that the details being managed were the faces of adult professional women was, in the 1960s, not considered especially remarkable. What it meant in practice was that you were never entirely off-duty in your own appearance. The moment you stepped into the airport in uniform, your face was a work product. If your lipstick wore off during the meal service, you were expected to reapply it during your galley break. If your foundation had transferred to your collar, you were expected to notice and address it before a passenger did. You were managing a performance of effortlessness, which required constant effort, which was not supposed to be visible. It is, if nothing else, an exhausting way to spend a Tuesday. Hair was not a personal matter in the 1960s airline industry, it was a policy matter. Length, color, and style were all subject to airline approval, and the standards were specific enough to inspire genuine bewilderment. Hair had to be kept off the collar. It could not fall below a certain length when worn down, and wearing it down was often not permitted at all during service. Colors were expected to be natural, which in practice meant the airline had an approved range of what counted as natural, and women with hair outside that range found themselves in conversations with supervisors about it. Some airlines required hair to be pinned up in specific styles, which led to flight attendants spending significant time before shifts on hairdos that could survive a full day of pressurized cabin air, meal service, and turbulence without moving. The updo requirement was, from an engineering standpoint, a genuine challenge. You needed a hairstyle that would look polished and composed at departure, maintain that appearance through the meal service, survive whatever atmospheric conditions the flight encountered, hold through the descent, and present well again at the gate. Hairspray was your primary tool. Significant quantities of hairspray, applied in layers, to a structure that was effectively being asked to function as load-bearing architecture for an 8-hour flight. Some women arrived at work with their hair already done from the night before, having slept carefully on one side to preserve the style, which is a specific kind of dedication to a dress code that most people reserve for things they actually care about. The color regulations created particular difficulty for women whose natural hair color did not fall within the approved range. Women with very light blonde hair were sometimes told it read as too casual or too conspicuous. Women with very dark hair were occasionally told the same. The approved range was, in practice, a band of medium tones, the hair colors that photographed well in the airline's promotional materials and did not draw attention away from the uniform. If your hair fell outside that band naturally, your options were to dye it into compliance or find another career. Some women dyed it, some left. What makes the hair regulations particularly strange in retrospect is the specificity. Airlines that were perfectly comfortable with very general policies about passenger safety managed to generate extraordinarily detailed documentation about acceptable bobby pin placement. The training manuals were thicker on the subject of appropriate hairstyling than on the subject of emergency door operation, which tells you something about where institutional attention was concentrated. The regulations eased as the decade progressed and cultural attitudes toward hair shifted. The late 1960s brought longer styles, more varied textures, and a broader cultural conversation about natural hair, particularly for black women, whose natural hair had been specifically excluded from the approved style range at many carriers. The relaxing of hair regulations was incremental, uneven, and always slightly behind the culture it was supposedly reflecting. But by the early 1970s, the updo was no longer mandatory. The approved color range had quietly widened, and the bobby pin documentation had been streamlined. Progress measured in hairpins. The 1960s flight attendant was expected to smile, not occasionally, not when she felt like it, not in response to something genuinely pleasant, but continuously, reliably, and at a standard that could be assessed and criticized by supervisors. Airlines trained their cabin crew in the art of the professional smile, not too wide, not too tight, warm but not overfamiliar, consistent across all passenger interactions regardless of what those passengers were doing or saying. Passenger satisfaction surveys of the era frequently included feedback on the flight attendant's smile, whether it was genuine, whether it was warm, whether it was sufficiently present. A woman who failed to project cheerfulness under any circumstance was failing at her job. Not the safety protocols, not the service standards, the smile. Training programs included specific instruction in what might be called smile maintenance. You practiced in mirrors. You were coached on the difference between a smile that reached your eyes and one that didn't, because passengers noticed, and passengers who noticed wrote letters, and letters went to management. The goal was what sociologists would later call emotional labor, the management of your internal emotional state to produce a consistent external performance, sustained over hours, regardless of what was actually happening inside. It is a skill. It is also performed under compulsion for an 8-hour shift, quietly exhausting. The smile was required under circumstances that would test anyone's cheerfulness. Passengers who were rude, passengers who were drunk, passengers who made comments about your appearance that were clearly intended as compliments but landed as something else. Passengers who rang the call button 4 times in 40 minutes for reasons that became increasingly difficult to categorize as legitimate requests. In each of these situations, the smile was mandatory. Not a polite, neutral expression, not a measured professional composure. A smile, warm and present, offered to the person who had just said something to you that you would spend the bus ride home trying to forget. Some women described developing what they called a flight face, a practiced expression they could hold indefinitely, one that satisfied the smile requirement without requiring genuine engagement. It was a dissociation technique, essentially. You sent your face to work and kept the rest of yourself somewhere quieter for the duration. The flight face smiled at the passenger who asked whether you were single. The flight face smiled at the passenger who asked whether all the girls on this route were as pretty as you. The rest of you was somewhere over the Atlantic, waiting for landing. Passenger satisfaction cards of the era asked respondents to rate the crew's friendliness, warmth, and willingness to assist. A low score on friendliness could result in a conversation with a supervisor. A pattern of low scores could affect your route assignments, your scheduling, your career trajectory. The smile was not optional in any meaningful sense. It was a performance metric, measured and tracked, with professional consequences for failure. You were, in effect, being graded on your ability to appear happy to be there. The fact that you were happy to be there, that many of these women genuinely loved the job, the travel, the work, was incidental. The smile was required regardless. In the 1960s, the culture of air travel permitted passengers, specifically male passengers, a degree of familiarity with flight attendants that would today be understood immediately and clearly as harassment. Comments about appearance were considered compliments and were expected to be received as such. Physical contact, a hand on an arm, a pat, worse, existed in a grey zone that the airlines were not particularly motivated to define or protect against. The flight attendant's job, as it was constructed by airline culture at the time, included the management of unwanted attention as a professional skill. You deflected, you redirected, you smiled. You did not escalate, because escalation created a scene, and scenes were bad for business, and business always came first. The training programs of the era included instruction in what was called passenger management, a category that covered everything from handling a nervous flyer to redirecting a passenger who had decided that the 4 hours of a domestic flight represented an appropriate window for pursuing a romantic interest in the woman serving his coffee. The techniques were practical and entirely one-sided. Use the passenger's name, maintain eye contact, redirect the conversation toward a service-related topic, excuse yourself with a task. The training did not include the option of telling a passenger directly that his behavior was unwelcome, because that option was not on the table. The passenger was always right, especially when he was wrong. First class was its own particular theatre. The passengers in first class were paying more, which in the logic of the era meant they were entitled to more, more service, more attention, more of your time, more of your patience. First-class passengers on certain carriers were served by dedicated crew members who spent the entirety of the flight within a short distance of a small number of men who had a great deal of money and very little to do for the next several hours. The ratio of passenger to attendant was low enough that there was nowhere to hide. If a first-class passenger wanted to talk to you, you talked to him. If he wanted to comment on your appearance, you received the comment. If he wanted to ask questions about your personal life, you answered them within the boundaries of the script and the smile. Some airlines framed this dynamic explicitly in their advertising. The infamous campaigns of the era, Pan Am's Fly Me advertisements, Continental's suggestion that its stewardesses would really move their tails for you, were not rogue marketing decisions made without airline approval. They were strategic campaigns, developed and signed off by airline executives that deliberately positioned the flight attendant as a service offering in the most personal possible sense. The women in those advertisements were real employees. They were shown those advertisements after they ran. Some objected. Their objections were noted and not acted upon. The absence of any formal complaint mechanism made the dynamic self-reinforcing. If you reported a passenger for inappropriate behavior, you were creating a problem. Problems required documentation. Documentation required supervisors. Supervisors asked questions about what you had done to manage the situation before it escalated. The implication that a skilled flight attendant should have been able to prevent the problem through better passenger management put the responsibility for the passenger's behavior onto the person it had been directed at. It is a logic that will be familiar to many women who have worked in customer-facing roles in any era, but in the 1960s airline industry, it was so thoroughly embedded in the professional culture that it wasn't recognized as logic at all. It was just the job. What changed it, eventually and incompletely, was the same combination of legal pressure and organized labor action that dismantled the marriage ban and the age limits. Flight attendant unions pushed for clearer policies around passenger behavior. Some airlines responded. The industry shifted, slowly, as the broader culture shifted around it. But for the women who worked through the 1960s, the shift came after the fact, acknowledged too late to undo what had already been asked of them. Flight attendants in the 1960s were frequently prohibited from eating in front of passengers, which sounds reasonable until you factor in the length of the shifts. On transatlantic routes that ran 8, 10, 12 hours, cabin crew were expected to serve multiple meal services, walk the aisles continuously, answer call buttons, manage cargo, conduct safety checks, and do all of it on whatever they could manage to eat discreetly in a galley the size of a closet during the brief gaps between service rounds. You could not sit down visibly. You could not eat visibly. You could not appear tired, hungry, or human in any way that passengers might find off-putting. The idea was that the service should feel effortless, which required considerable effort to conceal. The galley was your sanctuary, such as it was. A narrow corridor of stainless steel, ovens that ran hot, carts that refused to move smoothly, and approximately 3 square feet of counter space shared between however many crew members were working the same section. Eating happened here, standing up, quickly, usually over the cart you were about to push into the aisle. You might eat half a bread roll between the first and second drink service. You might eat a portion of a passenger meal that had been returned untouched. You might eat nothing for 4 hours because the service hadn't broken long enough to permit it. None of this was tracked or regulated. The regulation was simply that passengers should not see you doing it. The prohibition on visible eating coexisted, with beautiful irony, with the weight requirement. You were expected to maintain a specific weight, assessed on a regular basis with professional consequences for non-compliance, while working a physically demanding job in an environment where eating was restricted, irregular, and conducted under conditions that would challenge most people's ability to make nutritional choices. The system created the problem and then assessed you against a standard that the problem made harder to meet. This is, to put it gently, not a well-designed system. Some crew members ate before shifts, strategically and comprehensively, understanding that the next reliable meal opportunity might be several hours away. Others kept food in their bags, a piece of fruit, crackers, something portable and concealable, and ate in the galley in the specific way that flight attendants of this era learned to eat, which is to say, quickly, quietly, with one eye on the curtain in case a passenger appeared. The eating was not unlike the hiding of the wedding ring or the pre-inspection girdle removal, a workaround developed by practical women operating in an impractical system. Long-haul crews on international routes had it particularly difficult. A flight from New York to London in the 1960s was not a quick hop. It was hours of continuous service at altitude, followed by a layover that might be long enough to sleep but not long enough to fully recover, followed by the return flight with the same requirements. The physical toll of this schedule, on the body, on the appetite, on the sleep cycle, was significant. Airlines understood this in the abstract. They provided crew meals in the abstract. But the actual conditions under which those meals were consumed, or not consumed, were nobody's specific responsibility and nobody's documented concern. What you ate, when you ate it, and how you managed the relationship between a physically demanding job and a strictly regulated body weight was, in the end, your problem to solve. The airline provided the job, the scale, the weight chart, and the galley. The arithmetic was yours to manage, quietly, between the drink cart and the curtain at 30,000 feet. The machinery of regulation that governed flight attendants in the 1960s was not run entirely by men. A significant portion of the enforcement, the weigh-ins, the uniform checks, the makeup inspections, the demeanor assessments, was carried out by senior flight attendants and base supervisors who were themselves women. This created a layered and complicated dynamic. Women who had navigated the same system, internalized its standards, and now found themselves responsible for applying those standards to the next generation. Some supervisors were strict because the system rewarded strictness. Some were strict because they genuinely believed in the standards. And some were strict because they understood that if the inspection failed upward, the consequences landed on them too. The supervisory role was one of the few genuine career advancement opportunities available to flight attendants in this era. You could not, in most airlines, move into management in any broader sense. You could not become a pilot. You could not move into executive planning or operations in any meaningful way. But you could become a base supervisor, a senior position with its own uniform variant, its own authority, and its own set of accountabilities. The women who held these roles had earned them through seniority, through demonstrated competence, and through a willingness to operate within the system at a level that required enforcing it on others. This put them in an uncomfortable position that is not unique to the airline industry. When the rules are unjust and the system is structured to make women responsible for enforcing those rules on each other, the women doing the enforcing are simultaneously complicit in the system and constrained by it. A supervisor who declined to conduct the weigh-in was not making a feminist statement. She was failing to perform her job function, which had its own consequences. The system had been designed so that the path of least resistance was always compliance, at every level. Some supervisors used their authority with discretion. They conducted the inspections that were required of them but looked the other way on technicalities, approved borderline cases, gave warnings where policy dictated immediate action. Others were more exacting, strict interpreters of the rules, who conducted the touch checks and the weigh-ins and the makeup assessments with the same methodical precision they applied to everything else. Neither approach changed the rules. Both were responses to the same underlying structure. What this meant for the women being supervised was that the experience of enforcement varied enormously depending on who was running your base. An understanding supervisor could make the difference between a manageable career and a grinding one. A strict supervisor could make every pre-flight check feel like a performance review. The rules were the same either way, but the rules were only part of what was happening in that back room before departure, and everyone in the industry understood that. The supervisors, who eventually became advocates, who joined union organizing efforts, who testified in discrimination cases, who supported the legal challenges that dismantled the most egregious policies, often did so from a position of particular authority because they had enforced the policies and could speak to their implementation in specific, documented detail. Some of the most effective testimony in the cases that changed the industry came from women who had spent years on the other side of the scale. They knew exactly how the system worked because they had been required to run it. The golden age of air travel had a very particular face, and it was almost uniformly white. Major American carriers in the 1960s maintained hiring practices that effectively excluded black women from cabin crew positions. And when legal challenges forced some airlines to change, the resistance was fierce and the integration slow. Mohawk Airlines hired the first African-American flight attendant in the United States in 1958, a fact worth pausing on, because it means that for most of the decade being discussed, the image of the glamorous 1960s flight attendant was racially constructed as well as gendered. The rules about weight, appearance, and marriageability applied to all women who managed to get through the door, but getting through the door was itself a gatekeeping exercise that many women were never permitted to attempt. The exclusion was rarely explicit in written policy. Airlines had learned to be careful about the language they put into official documentation. Instead, it operated through the application process, through recruiters who found reasons not to advance certain candidates, through photograph requirements that enabled visual screening, through interview processes conducted by panels that reflected no diversity and demonstrated no particular motivation to create it. A black woman, applying to be a flight attendant at a major American carrier in 1962, was applying to an institution that had already decided what it was looking for, and what it was looking for did not include her. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 changed the legal framework, and lawsuits followed. Black women who had been rejected by airlines filed discrimination complaints. Some of those complaints were upheld. Airlines were ordered to revise their hiring practices. Compliance was uneven and often minimal, meeting the letter of the requirement, while finding new ways to limit the reality of integration. It was a pattern familiar from every other industry navigating civil rights enforcement in this period. Technical compliance as a substitute for genuine change. The women who did break through faced a workplace that had not been designed with them in mind, not in its aesthetic standards, not in its hair regulations, not in its makeup requirements, and not in its culture. Hair policies that mandated natural colors and styles were written with one kind of hair in mind. Foundation requirements that referenced even skin tone were calibrated for one skin tone. Black flight attendants in this era were navigating the same punishing system of regulations as their white colleagues, plus the additional layer of working in an environment that had actively resisted their presence and had not fundamentally restructured itself to acknowledge them. The history of racial integration in the airline cabin crew workforce is not a triumphant story with a clean resolution. It is a slower, harder story of individual women who applied anyway, who filed complaints and showed up to hearings and continued doing their jobs in environments that were not always welcoming. The face of the golden age of air travel was constructed deliberately and maintained carefully. The women who were excluded from that construction paid the cost of it, and the women who forced their way into it changed it, not because the industry invited them, but because they insisted. Flight attendants in the 1960s wore name tags. This was standard practice and seemed, on its surface, like a neutral professional convention. But in the context of everything else, the culture of familiarity that passengers were permitted, the requirement to remain pleasant under any circumstances, the prohibition against establishing boundaries, the name tag meant something specific. It meant you were always identifiable, always accessible, always reachable by name, by any passenger who wanted to reach you. There was no professional distance to hide behind. The name was right there, on the chest, pinned to the regulation uniform, just below the regulation smile. You were not a role, you were a person, specifically available for personal interaction at all times. Passengers used the names freely, not excuse me or miss, your name, used with the specific familiarity that comes from having read it off a badge, a familiarity that had not been earned through any actual acquaintance. Some passengers used it warmly, which was fine. Some used it repeatedly in a single interaction, in a way that was designed to create a sense of intimacy that the interaction did not actually warrant. Some used it in letters of complaint after the flight, citing you by first name in descriptions of perceived slights, which then landed on your supervisor's desk with your name already attached. The name tag made every interaction personal, whether or not you wanted it to be. The airlines understood what they were doing. Personalization was a deliberate service strategy. Passengers who felt they were being served by a person rather than a function were more likely to report a positive experience, more likely to choose the airline again, more likely to write the kind of passenger satisfaction feedback that carriers tracked carefully. The name tag was part of that strategy. It made the service feel warmer, more individual, more considered. The fact that it also made the person wearing it more exposed, more identifiable, more difficult to retreat behind the professional neutrality that might have offered some protection, that was not a concern that entered the strategy. Some women found the name tag useful. It established a quick rapport, gave passengers something concrete to attach to the interaction, and reduced the slightly impersonal quality of a transaction conducted at altitude with a stranger. Others found it intrusive, a small piece of themselves pinned to their uniform and offered up to whoever bought a ticket on this particular Tuesday. The feeling of being identified, categorized, and accessed by strangers for hours on end is something that is difficult to fully articulate unless you have experienced it professionally, which most of the people designing these systems had not. The alternative, a more anonymous form of identification, a number or a role designation rather than a first name, was never seriously considered, because it would have reduced the warmth of the service interaction, which was the product being sold. The warmth required the name required the person, and the person, once named, was available. The math was simple. It was also entirely one-directional. The passenger knew your name. You knew nothing about the passenger except what was visible across the meal cart. The intimacy flowed one way, as it was designed to, as it had always been designed to, because asymmetry was the point. Some international carriers in the 1960s required flight attendants to be conversational in multiple languages, which sounds like a reasonable professional standard until you consider that the same airlines required those multilingual women to use formal registers only, never to share personal opinions, and to restrict conversation to scripted service interactions. The language requirement wasn't about genuine communication, it was about accessibility. Passengers traveling internationally wanted to feel understood and catered to in their own tongue. The flight attendant's job was to provide that feeling, in the correct tone, at the correct register, without the conversation ever becoming mutual in any real sense. You could speak 6 languages fluently and still not be permitted to have an actual conversation. The language testing process was its own particular obstacle. Airlines that required bilingual crew members assessed language proficiency during the application process, which meant that a woman's French, her German, her Japanese, was evaluated alongside her posture and her smile and the circumference of her ankles. Language was an asset, but it was assessed in the same transactional framework as everything else, not as an intellectual achievement, but as a service feature. Your fluency in Portuguese was valuable in the same way your cheekbones were valuable, because it made the product more appealing to the customer. On international routes, the language requirement could mean managing communications in several languages over the course of a single flight. A transatlantic route might carry passengers from multiple countries with different languages, different customs around service interactions, and different expectations about what a flight attendant's accessibility and warmth should look and sound like. You adapted. You shifted registers between passengers, between languages, between cultural frameworks for what polite service interaction looked like. It was a significant cognitive load, performed continuously, while also managing the meal cart, the safety protocols, the galley logistics, and the ongoing requirement to appear untroubled by any of it. The restriction to scripted interaction was particularly confining for women who were naturally fluent and naturally communicative, who had genuine curiosity about the passengers they were serving and real things to say. The script covered service requests, safety information, and pleasantries. It did not cover anything that would require the flight attendant to present herself as a person with a perspective, a history, a point of view. On a 12-hour flight, maintaining that restriction while also projecting the warmth and accessibility the airline required was an exercise in managed performance that went well beyond what was visible to the passengers receiving it. What this created, in practice, was a kind of professional ventriloquism. The words were yours, your French, your grammar, your pronunciation, but the content was the airline's. You were the voice. The airline was the script. For women who had worked hard to develop genuine language ability, who had perhaps studied abroad or grown up bilingual and brought that skill to the job as something they were proud of, the reduction of that skill to a service feature was its own particular diminishment. You could say anything in 4 languages. The airline had decided what that anything would be. For flight attendants based in major cities in the 1960s, the airline's influence on daily life didn't stop when the shift ended. Some carriers maintained dormitory-style housing for their crew, and life in those residences came with its own set of regulations. Curfews were common, male visitors were restricted or prohibited. The logic was ostensibly about rest and readiness. Crew needed to be sharp for early departures, but the effect was the oversight of adult women's private lives by their employers, extended into the hours when those women were technically off the clock. Some airlines assigned roommates, some conducted residence inspections. The job, in other words, had a lease. The dormitory arrangements varied by carrier and by city. Some airlines maintained dedicated crew houses, large buildings near the airport, efficiently managed and regularly inspected, where newly hired flight attendants were expected to live for their first year or 2 of employment. Others had arrangements with specific residential buildings, steering crew toward approved housing with approved landlords who understood the airline's expectations about curfews and visitors. In either case, the message was consistent. The airline's interest in your behavior and your readiness did not end at the departure gate. Curfews were typically set around 11 or midnight on days before early departures. This was not unreasonable in principle. A crew member who had been out until 3 in the morning was a liability on a 6 a.m. boarding, but the enforcement mechanisms extended into the general principle of where you were and with whom, on any given evening, whether you had a morning flight or not. Some crew houses had sign-in sheets. Some had house monitors, senior residents who were responsible for ensuring compliance. You signed in, you went to your room, you managed whatever life you were trying to have within the parameters available to you. The prohibition on male visitors was the regulation that generated the most creative workarounds. Women who were in relationships, married or otherwise, hidden or otherwise, navigated the visitor policy through a combination of alternative meeting locations, carefully managed schedules, and the specific ingenuity of people who have learned to work around rules they find unreasonable. The airline's position was that male visitors in crew housing were a distraction and a potential source of noise or disruption. The women's position, largely unvoiced because voicing it would have created a problem, was that they were adults who had earned the right to have people in their homes. What the dormitory system accomplished, beyond its stated purpose, was the extension of the airline's supervision into every hour of the day. You were on duty during the flight. You were inspected before and after the flight. You were curfewed and monitored in your off hours. The life that existed outside the airline's direct oversight was narrow, a few hours in a city you were passing through, in a hotel the airline had chosen, before a departure the airline had scheduled. The job did not merely require your presence, it organized your existence around its own requirements, around the clock, on the ground and in the air. Flight attendant training programs in the 1960s were intensive, exhaustive, and, depending on your perspective, either impressively thorough or an extended exercise in identity replacement. Over the course of 4 to 6 weeks, trainees were instructed in emergency procedures, first aid, food service, aircraft systems, and passenger management. They were also instructed in posture, deportment, makeup application, conversational etiquette, and the management of their own facial expressions. The training had 2 parallel tracks running simultaneously, one serious and safety-focused, the other cosmetic and behavioral. By the end of it, the expectation was that you had become someone capable of conducting an emergency evacuation and also someone whose resting expression projected warmth, competence, and the suggestion that being at 30,000 feet was your natural and preferred state. The safety training was genuinely rigorous. You learned the specific emergency procedures for each aircraft type in the fleet. You practiced door operation until the sequence was automatic. You learned evacuation commands and practiced delivering them with the volume and authority necessary to be heard over engines and panic. You trained in water ditching procedures, how to deploy life rafts, how to manage passengers in water, how to conduct a head count in the dark. You practiced first aid scenarios until your responses were reflexive. This part of the training was taken seriously by the instructors and by the trainees, because it was the part where the stakes were obvious. You might need this. It might be the thing between a full aircraft and a catastrophe. Running alongside this, in the same classrooms, on the same schedule, was the other curriculum. You practiced walking across the room and were corrected on your posture mid-stride. You sat down and stood up repeatedly while an instructor assessed the elegance of the movement. You practiced the smile in front of mirrors, adjusted the angle, adjusted the warmth, adjusted the register. You practiced serving a meal tray with your back straight and your expression composed, and your heel not catching on the demonstrator aircraft's carpet. You practiced receiving a rude comment from a simulated difficult passenger and responding with redirection, warmth, and the smile that by this point you had been practicing for 3 weeks. The two curricula were never in tension as far as the training program was concerned. They were presented as equally important components of a unified professional standard. A flight attendant who could conduct a perfect emergency evacuation but had poor posture was not meeting the standard. A flight attendant with perfect posture who had not mastered the door operation was also not meeting the standard. You were being trained to be excellent at all of it simultaneously, because the product required all of it simultaneously. The fact that one half of the curriculum concerned keeping people alive and the other concerned the angle of your chin during meal service was not, in the 1960s training environment, considered an imbalance. It was considered the job. By the end of the program, you were assessed on everything. The safety knowledge was tested formally, written exams, practical demonstrations. The presentation standards were assessed by observation, supervisors watching how you moved, how you smiled, how you managed a mock service interaction with a mock difficult passenger. You graduated from the program as a specific kind of person, one the airline had spent 6 weeks building, and you arrived on your first flight as that person, which was more or less what you would be for the duration of your employment, unless you became a supervisor, in which case you became the person responsible for building the next version. Before training even began, applicants to flight attendant programs in the 1960s were required to pass a physical examination. This was not a standard workplace health screening. It was a detailed assessment of physical appearance, proportion, and presentation. Examiners checked teeth. They evaluated posture. They noted skin condition. Some airlines measured the circumference of ankles. The examination was conducted with the same bureaucratic seriousness one might apply to assessing a thoroughbred, and it was understood by everyone involved to be entirely normal. Women who failed on purely physical grounds, not medical grounds, not safety grounds, but aesthetic grounds, were simply not hired, with no recourse and no explanation beyond a polite form letter. The medical component of the examination was legitimate and relatively standard. Vision was tested. Flight attendants needed to see clearly enough to operate in a dynamic environment. Hearing was assessed. General health indicators were reviewed. These were reasonable occupational requirements for a physically demanding job conducted at altitude, and they would be recognizable in any era as appropriate baseline screening. Then the examination continued past the medical component and into territory that had nothing to do with health in any clinical sense. Teeth were assessed for straightness, color, and general appearance. Not because dental health affected the ability to conduct an evacuation, but because a flight attendant's smile was a product feature, and the teeth behind the smile were therefore a component of quality control. Skin was assessed for visible blemishes, uneven tone, or anything that foundation might not fully address. Posture was measured against a standard. Weight was checked against the chart. Proportions were noted in documentation that used language borrowed from the fashion industry rather than the medical profession, not within healthy parameters but suitable for uniform. The ankle measurement deserves its own moment. Some airlines, in conducting the physical examination, measured the circumference of the candidate's ankles against an approved range. The ankle, in this context, was a visual element, a part of the body visible below the uniform hemline when standing, observable by passengers, and subject to the airline's aesthetic standard. An ankle that was assessed as too thick was an ankle that did not meet the standard. The candidate attached to that ankle was declined. She received the polite form letter. She never learned that it was her ankle. What the physical examination communicated, in aggregate, was that the body of a prospective flight attendant was a document, something to be read, assessed, and either approved or rejected on the basis of its contents. The woman inside the body was relevant to the process primarily as the mechanism by which the body arrived for inspection. Her qualifications, her languages, her temperament, her genuine interest in the work, these were secondary considerations that became relevant only if the body passed. The body came first. It was always the body first, and if the body didn't pass, the rest of you went home with it, uninspected, unevaluated, and thanked for your time. The rules governing flight attendants in the 1960s were not hidden, they were, to a remarkable extent, openly celebrated. Airlines ran advertising campaigns that featured their cabin crew prominently. Young, beautiful, smiling, available. "I'm Cheryl, fly me," ran one infamous campaign. The pitch was nakedly transactional, and it worked, in the sense that it sold tickets, because the travelling public of the era was largely willing to accept the premise. The flight attendant was marketed as part of the product. The rules that governed her appearance, her age, her marital status, her weight, were the quality controls behind the brand promise. If you bought a ticket, you were buying an experience, and the experience included her. The advertising of this era was designed by men at advertising agencies for an audience they understood to be primarily male, specifically the business traveller, who was the most lucrative and most loyal segment of the commercial aviation market. Business travellers flew repeatedly on expense accounts, and they chose airlines with a consistency that made them enormously valuable. The airlines wanted their business, and they designed their product accordingly. The flight attendant, in this framework, was not primarily a safety officer or a service professional. She was a feature of the cabin environment, like the seat width or the quality of the coffee, and she was marketed in those terms. The Fly Me campaign was the most candid expression of a philosophy that the industry had been operating under for a decade. It said, plainly, what the age limits and the appearance standards and the marriage ban had been implying all along, that the flight attendant's primary value was her physical presence, her youth, her availability, and that these qualities were things a passenger could access by purchasing a ticket. The women who appeared in those advertisements had not been consulted about the campaign before it ran. Some were deeply uncomfortable with it. Some objected formally. Their objections were received, noted, and set aside. What made the PR campaign particularly effective was that it worked on multiple levels simultaneously. For male passengers, it offered the obvious appeal. For female passengers, and there were female passengers, in growing numbers, particularly on leisure routes, it offered an aspirational image. The flight attendant was glamorous, independent, worldly. She travelled constantly, wore beautiful uniforms, moved through the world with a confidence that was genuinely appealing. The restrictions that governed her life, the weigh-ins, the age caps, the marriage ban, were not visible in the advertisements because they were not the product being sold. The product was the image. The image was freedom. The reality was a back room with a scale. The gap between the image and the reality was enormous, and for most of the 1960s it was largely invisible to the public. The women who worked under these conditions did not, for the most part, speak publicly about them. They were bound by professional culture, by the fear of being labelled difficult, and by the practical reality that the job, despite everything, offered them things that were genuinely valuable: independence, travel, income, identity. Criticizing it publicly meant risking all of that. So the image persisted, selling the product, building the brand, while the women at the center of it managed the distance between what they were being told they were and what they were actually being asked to do. It was a significant distance. They managed it every day. The pushback didn't arrive all at once. It came in individual complaints, in conversations on layovers, in women quietly comparing notes about which rules were the most absurd and which supervisors were the most unreasonable. It came in the founding of union chapters and the careful, painstaking filing of discrimination claims under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, a law that, once it included sex as a protected category, gave flight attendants a legal foothold they had never had before. Dusty Rhodes and other early advocates in the Association of Flight Attendants began challenging the marriage ban, the age limits, the weight regulations, one legal action at a time. It was slow, it was expensive, and it was contested at every step by airlines who argued, with a straight face, that the ability to fire a woman for getting married was essential to the passenger experience. The early organizing happened in the margins of the job itself, on layovers, in crew rooms, in the brief windows between flights when women had enough privacy to speak honestly about what the work was actually like. These conversations were careful at first. The culture of the industry discouraged complaint, and a reputation for being difficult was a professional liability that followed you from base to base. But the complaints were too consistent, too shared, too widely recognized as legitimate to stay private forever. Women who had never met were describing the same experiences, the same policies, the same supervisors, applying the same rules with the same indifference to the people they governed. The commonality of the experience was, once named, radicalizing. The Association of Flight Attendants was the organizational vehicle through which much of this energy found its expression. Founded as the Airline Stewardesses Association in 1945, it had spent its early decades focused on working conditions in the conventional sense: scheduling, pay, rest requirements. By the mid-1960s, it was being pushed by its members into territory that felt more personal and more urgent. The marriage ban, the age limits, the weight checks, the physical inspections. The women filing these grievances were not abstract complainants. They were members who had been weighed that morning, or who had been told last week that their career was ending because they had turned 32, or who had been dismissed the month before because their pregnancy had become visible. The complaints had faces. They had names. They had documented histories with specific airlines and specific supervisors and specific dates. Legal action required a different kind of courage. Filing a discrimination complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission meant putting your name on a document, attaching it to a claim, and submitting it to an institution that was itself new and underfunded and still figuring out how to process the volume of claims arriving from every direction since the Civil Rights Act had expanded its jurisdiction. The EEOC in its early years was not a swift or certain instrument of justice. Cases sat. Responses were slow. Airlines had lawyers whose entire job was to contest claims and extend timelines. The women who filed anyway, who waited years for rulings, who gave depositions, who appeared at hearings and answered questions about their weight and their marital status and their career histories in front of panels of men, were doing something that required a specific, sustained kind of bravery that doesn't photograph as dramatically as a march but matters just as much. What kept the movement going, through the slow years and the contested rulings and the airline counter-arguments, was the recognition that the alternative was acceptance. Accepting the weigh-in, accepting the marriage ban, accepting the age limit as a reasonable professional boundary. The women who refused to accept it did not do so because the odds were good. They did so because the alternative was worse. And slowly, unevenly, imperfectly, the rules began to change. A layover sounds, in theory, like a rest. In practice, for flight attendants in the 1960s, it was more of a holding pattern. Crew were typically housed in airline-approved hotels, often not particularly nice ones, for whatever hours separated one flight from the next. Sleep schedules were erratic. You might land at 2 in the morning and board again at 7. Meals were catch as catch can, which was a particular irony given that you had just spent 8 hours serving food to other people. The layover hotel room was simultaneously your bedroom, your kitchen, your break room, and the only private space you had in a work life conducted almost entirely in public. Some women loved the travel. Some found the isolation grinding. Most found it both, sometimes in the same afternoon. The hotel itself was often chosen by the airline on the basis of a negotiated rate, rather than any particular consideration of crew welfare. You landed in a city you might never have visited, were driven to a hotel you had not chosen, were deposited in a room with a window overlooking a parking structure, and were expected to sleep efficiently and wake refreshed. The room service menu, if there was one, existed at your own expense. The airline covered the room. What you did inside it, how you ate, how you slept, how you managed the particular disorientation of being a person whose body clock was several time zones behind the clock on the nightstand, was your own logistical problem. The disorientation was real and cumulative. A flight attendant working international routes in the 1960s was regularly operating across multiple time zones in the same week. You left New York in the evening and arrived in London at breakfast. You spent 36 hours in London, enough to sleep, to walk around, to eat something in a restaurant that was not a galley, and then you boarded again. By the time you landed back in New York, your body had its own private opinion about what time it was, and that opinion was not compatible with the schedule your supervisor had sent you. You functioned anyway, because the job required functioning, and the smile was required regardless of what the nightstand clock said. Some cities were genuinely wonderful. Crew, who flew the same international routes, regularly developed real affection for their layover cities. The specific cafe near the hotel where the coffee was good, the neighborhood that was worth the walk, the local market that was open early enough to visit before the return flight. These small rituals were the texture of a working life that was unusual in ways that were sometimes genuinely enviable. You were in Paris. You were in Tokyo. You were in cities that most people you grew up with would never visit, and you were there regularly enough that they started to feel, in some small way, like yours. But the loneliness was also real. The crew who landed together dispersed into their individual rooms. The city was outside, and you were in it, but you were also alone in a hotel room in a time zone your body didn't recognize, with a wake-up call scheduled for 5:30, and nowhere in particular to be between now and then. You had just spent 8 hours being available to hundreds of people, and now you were available to nobody, in a room that would be cleaned and reset for the next guest before the sheets were cold. It was a specific kind of solitude. Not unpleasant, exactly, but noticeable. The layover was your time. There just wasn't always enough of it, or the right kind of it, to feel like rest. In the 1960s, the safety briefing delivered by flight attendants before takeoff was treated by the majority of passengers as an ambient soundtrack, pleasant, vaguely comforting background noise to be politely ignored while they settled their cocktails and opened their newspapers. The flight attendants delivering those briefings, however, had been rigorously trained in the actual content. They knew the emergency exits. They knew the inflation procedures. They knew the brace position and the evacuation protocols, and what to do if the oxygen masks failed to deploy. They were, in a very real sense, the most prepared people on the aircraft, and they were also the people most consistently dismissed as decoration by the passengers who needed them most. The briefing itself was choreographed, rehearsed, and delivered with the same professional precision as everything else in the cabin crew's performance. Arms extended to indicate exits, fingers pointed with deliberate clarity, the oxygen mask demonstrated with the specific mime that has remained essentially unchanged across 6 decades of commercial aviation. The words were memorized, the timing was practiced. The crew member delivering the briefing had done it hundreds of times, and the repetition had not dulled the underlying content. She knew what the exits were for, what the raft deployment required, what the brace position was designed to protect. The passenger, looking past her to check his watch, did not. This was the central paradox of the flight attendant's professional identity in this era. The industry marketed her as a service figure, the smiling presence who brought your drink and remembered your name and made the cabin feel welcoming. The training had built her into something considerably more serious. A safety professional, certified in emergency procedures, capable of managing a cabin full of panicking passengers through an evacuation that might take place in darkness, in water, with a significant portion of the aircraft infrastructure unavailable. Both of these things were true simultaneously, and the industry chose, in its marketing and in its culture, to emphasize only one of them. The passengers who dismissed the safety briefing were, from one angle, behaving rationally. The probability of needing the information in any given flight was low, and the probability of their life depending on a rapid recall of which side held exit row B was lower still. But from another angle, they were benefiting from a protection they didn't acknowledge, delivered by someone they had categorized as staff rather than safety officer. The flight attendant who had spent 6 weeks learning evacuation procedures, who had practiced door operation until it was automatic, who knew the ditching protocol for a water landing in the specific aircraft she was working that day. She was standing 3 feet away. The passenger was reading his newspaper. This was the arrangement, and it suited everyone except the person standing there. Incidents in which flight attendants performed exactly the function they had been trained for, managing evacuations, administering first aid, maintaining calm in a cabin that had every reason to panic, were documented throughout the era. The accounts from those incidents are consistent in a specific way. The crew member who kept people moving toward the exit, who made the calls, who performed the function, had been trained to do exactly that. The training was real, the competence was real, the dismissal of both, as default and routine, was also real. The flight attendants of the 1960s were professionals operating inside a public perception that insisted on seeing them as something less, and they did their jobs anyway, every flight, with the exits located and the procedures memorized and the smile in place for when it was over. Maintaining the required weight wasn't simply a matter of eating less. It was a constant, low-grade negotiation between a physically demanding job and a number on a scale that had been set by someone who had never done the job. Flight attendants who found themselves approaching the upper limit of their approved range had limited options: diet, exercise, and the specific quiet desperation of standing on a scale in a uniform, knowing that the result would have professional consequences. Some women developed disordered eating patterns during this era that followed them for decades. The airlines, to their credit, did not ask about any of this. They simply noted the number, compared it to the chart, and either sent you to work or sent you home. Diet culture in the 1960s was itself a complicated landscape. The era produced an enormous range of weight loss products, programs, and philosophies, many of which were enthusiastically embraced by a culture that had decided, with remarkable confidence, that thinness was both achievable by anyone and indicative of personal virtue. Diet pills were widely available and widely used, some containing amphetamines, some containing thyroid hormones, some containing compounds whose effects on the body were not well understood by the people prescribing them. They were prescribed by doctors who had been told by pharmaceutical companies that they were safe and effective, and they were taken by women who needed to meet a number on a chart by a specific date. Flight attendants in this era described their relationship with food in terms that are recognizable to anyone who has ever eaten in response to an external standard rather than internal hunger. You ate strategically. You ate in relation to the weigh-in schedule rather than in relation to appetite. You ate less before the check and more after, then less again as the next one approached, a rhythm of restriction and release that had been imposed from outside and was now running, automatically, inside. The body adapts to what it is required to do, which is both its greatest strength and, in circumstances like these, a kind of loss. You stopped trusting your own hunger. You started trusting the chart. The physical demands of the job made this particularly difficult. Walking the aisle of a full aircraft for 8 hours is not sedentary work. Managing the galley, lifting service carts, conducting emergency drills, standing during boarding and deplaning, the job required a functional, energized body, the kind that needs fuel to operate. The weight requirement was pulling in the opposite direction, toward a body that had been trimmed to a number, regardless of what that body needed to do with the day. The tension between these two requirements, be light enough for the chart, be strong enough for the work, was never acknowledged by the airlines' attention. It was simply the standard. Women who left the industry in this era and have spoken about it in later decades consistently describe the weight requirement as one of the most psychologically lasting aspects of the job. Not the rudest passenger, not the longest shift, not the worst turbulence, the scale. The specific experience of having your body assessed by an employer on a regular basis, with your livelihood attached to the outcome, does something to the relationship between a person and her own physical self that does not simply resolve when the employment ends. The chart went away. The habit of measuring, of checking, of calculating the distance between what you were and what was required of you, that took considerably longer. By the middle of the 1960s, the flight attendant had been transformed into something larger than a job description. She was a cultural symbol of modernity, of mobility, of a particular kind of aspirational femininity that was simultaneously bold and compliant. She traveled the world, which was glamorous. She operated under rules that would strike most people today as controlling, which was invisible. The image of the smiling stewardess in her fitted uniform was used to sell everything from airlines to cigarettes to the general proposition that the future was bright and sleek and moving at 500 miles an hour. That she herself had very little power over the conditions of her own employment was, for the purposes of the advertising campaign, beside the point. The cultural construction of the flight attendant as symbol happened quickly and with considerable deliberate effort. Airlines understood that they were selling more than transportation. They were selling an experience, an aspiration, a vision of modernity in which air travel was exciting and glamorous and entirely accessible to the right kind of person with the right kind of money. The flight attendant was central to that vision. She was the human face of the modern age, the person who handed you your drink at altitude and made the implausible seem routine. She was proof that the future was not only possible but pleasant. For young women watching from the outside, the image was genuinely appealing. The flight attendant of the 1960s advertising era was independent in a way that was not always available through other paths. She had a career, she had her own income, she traveled to cities that her peers might never visit, wore beautifully designed uniforms, moved through the world with a confidence and a freedom that was being actively constructed for the camera, but that reflected something real about what the job offered. The restrictions, the weigh-ins, the marriage ban, the age cap were not part of the image, and so they were not part of what young women were evaluating when they decided whether to apply. The symbol served multiple audiences simultaneously. For male passengers, it offered the appeal of the advertising campaigns, the young, beautiful, available woman who was professionally obligated to be pleasant to you for the duration of the flight. For female passengers, it offered a version of aspiration. Here is a woman who has made something of herself, who is moving through the world, who is not waiting at home. For the general culture, it offered proof that progress was happening, that the modern age was arriving on schedule, that the future was something to look forward to. The actual woman doing the job was doing the work of sustaining all three of these readings simultaneously, which was its own particular labor, unacknowledged and unpaid. What the symbol obscured, by design and by the limitations of the medium, was the labor behind it, the preparation before the flight, the management of appearance and emotion during it, the physical demands of the work, the regulatory environment that governed every aspect of the job, from the undergarments to the retirement date. None of this was visible in the photograph. The photograph showed a woman smiling at altitude, effortlessly beautiful, warmly present, apparently delighted to be there. The photograph was the product. The woman was the means of production. And the distance between those two things was the invisible work of the 1960s flight attendant, performed every day, never quite visible, never entirely acknowledged, and for a long time never named. For all the indignities of the job, it did come with things that mattered enormously to young women in the 1960s. Travel, first and foremost, actual, real, international travel, at a time when that was not something most women of modest backgrounds could expect to do. Financial independence. A flight attendant earned a salary, had her own money, and could live in a city away from her family at an age when many of her peers were expected to stay close to home and wait for marriage. A degree of professional identity. The job had status, at least in the public imagination, even if the internal reality was something more complicated. And community, the specific, intense bond that forms between people who share unusual working conditions and learn to depend on one another at altitude. The travel benefit was real, and it was significant. In the 1960s, international air travel was expensive enough that it remained out of reach for most American families. A flight attendant who was based in New York and working international routes was visiting European cities on a schedule that would have required considerable planning and expense for a civilian. She was in Paris in a way that her college roommate, now married and living in the suburbs, was not. This was not a small thing. It was a genuine expansion of the world available to her, and it was available specifically because of the job. The financial independence was equally significant in context. The 1960s were a decade in which married women in many American states still could not open a bank account in their own name without their husband's signature, in which credit cards were routinely denied to women without a male co-signer, in which the assumption of economic dependence was so embedded in the legal and financial architecture of daily life that independence required active effort to achieve. A flight attendant had a paycheck. She managed it herself. She signed her own lease. These were not trivial advantages in an era when the alternative was often economic absorption into a marriage. The community was perhaps the least visible perk to anyone outside the industry and the most important to anyone inside it. Women who worked the same routes together, who navigated the same layovers and the same difficult passengers and the same pre-flight inspections, developed a specific kind of solidarity. The kind that forms between people who understand exactly what you mean when you describe something because they were there, or somewhere exactly like it, on a Tuesday that looked exactly the same. The crew room was its own world, with its own humour and its own shorthand and its own understanding of what the job actually asked of you, which was different from what the advertising suggested, and different again from what the passengers imagined. For all of this, the job asked a great deal. The trade was not equal, and the women who did it knew it was not equal, even the ones who loved it, even the ones who would do it again. But the things it offered, the world, the money, the community, the specific freedom of being 30,000 feet from wherever you came from, were real, and they were worth something. And the women who chose the job chose it at least in part because they understood what they were getting. They also understood what they were giving. Most of them made the calculation anyway, and most of them have no regrets about having made it, which is its own kind of answer to the question of whether it was worth it. Flight attendants in the 1960s were trained in first aid, but the reality of medical emergencies at 30,000 feet in the pre-defibrillator era was that first aid often meant managing a serious situation with very limited tools, and no backup until the aircraft landed. Heart attacks happened, allergic reactions happened, psychiatric episodes happened, passengers went into labour, passengers stopped breathing. And in each of these cases, the first person on the scene was typically a young woman in a pillbox hat who had been trained to handle it, was expected to handle it calmly, and would return to regular meal service once it was resolved. None of this was mentioned in the advertising campaigns. The medical kit available on commercial aircraft in the 1960s was modest by any standard. Bandages, basic medications, ammonia capsules, a blood pressure cuff if the carrier was well equipped. There were no defibrillators. Those would not become standard equipment on commercial aircraft for decades. There was no direct radio consultation with ground-based physicians in real time. There was the training, the kit, the crew member, and whatever medical knowledge happened to be sitting in the passenger cabin in the form of a doctor or nurse who might or might not identify themselves when asked. You asked. Sometimes someone raised their hand, sometimes nobody did. Managing a cardiac event in a pressurized aircraft cabin with a blood pressure cuff and an aspirin requires a specific kind of calm that is not the same as the calm required to serve a meal tray. It is the calm of someone who has assessed the situation, identified the available resources, made a decision, and is now executing it while also managing the reactions of the surrounding passengers who are watching, who are frightened, who are in an enclosed space at altitude and cannot leave. The flight attendant managing the emergency was managing all of this simultaneously. The patient, the cabin, the crew coordination, the communication with the flight deck, and the ongoing requirement to project a composure that kept the rest of the aircraft from escalating into its own separate problem. Some of the women who worked through this era have described medical emergencies in the matter-of-fact tones of professionals who have seen difficult things and processed them as part of the job. Others have described moments of acute fear, the specific fear of being the most qualified person in a situation that exceeds your qualifications, of knowing what the training covered and knowing simultaneously that this particular situation is testing the edges of it. Both responses are honest, and both exist in the same professional history. What is notable is the absence of formal acknowledgement. A flight attendant who managed a cardiac event, kept a passenger alive until landing, coordinated the emergency response, and maintained cabin calm throughout received no particular recognition for it. Not in her personnel file, not in her compensation, not in the industry's public presentation of what the job entailed. She returned to the meal service. She did the post-flight inspection. She went to the layover hotel. The event was documented in the incident report and filed. The advertising campaign continued to show her smiling. Both things were true, and only one of them was visible. The legal dismantling of the 1960s flight attendant rules was not a single dramatic moment. It was a decade-long series of complaints, hearings, rulings, appeals, and counter-appeals. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission received cases from flight attendants challenging weight limits, age limits, marriage bans, and pregnancy policies. Some rulings came down clearly and quickly. Others were contested by airlines arguing that their standards were legitimate occupational requirements, that passengers genuinely needed their flight attendants to be young, unmarried, and below a certain weight in order for the flight to function. Courts disagreed, eventually and unevenly. By the early 1970s, the most egregious rules had been struck down, though not without years of organized resistance. The legal strategy that proved most effective was the one that tied the flight attendant rules directly to the sex discrimination provisions of the Civil Rights Act. The argument was straightforward. No airline applied equivalent restrictions to its male employees. Male cabin crew, pursers, stewards on international routes were not weighed before their shifts. They were not retired at 32. They were not dismissed for marrying. The rules that governed female cabin crew were applied exclusively on the basis of sex, which the Civil Rights Act had made illegal. The airlines contested this characterization energetically, arguing that the roles were different, that the passenger expectations were different, that the nature of the position created legitimate distinctions that justified different standards. The EEOC, in its early years, was not always swift in its responses. The Commission had been created with jurisdiction over a vast range of employment discrimination and was processing cases from every industry simultaneously with limited staff and contested authority. Flight attendant cases sometimes waited years for formal responses. Some were resolved through settlement negotiations, airlines agreeing to modify specific policies without formal rulings in exchange for the withdrawal of the complaint. This resolved individual cases without creating precedents, which suited the airlines and frustrated the advocates who wanted binding decisions that would apply industry-wide. The court cases that did produce precedents were hard-won. Airline lawyers were experienced, well-resourced, and creative in their arguments. They produced evidence that passengers preferred young, attractive, unmarried cabin crew. They argued that appearance standards were bona fide occupational qualifications under the law. They argued that age limits were safety measures. They argued, in some cases, that the entire regulatory framework was a reasonable business decision that did not constitute discrimination because it applied to the role rather than to any individual. Courts worked through these arguments methodically, and the conclusions they reached were not always the ones the plaintiffs had sought. Some cases were won, some were lost. Some were won partially, with rulings that addressed one policy while leaving adjacent ones untouched. What accumulated over the course of the late 1960s and early 1970s was a body of precedent that made the most extreme practices indefensible. The marriage ban fell first, widely and relatively quickly, as the EEOC made clear that it was straightforward sex discrimination with no legitimate occupational justification. The age limits fell more slowly, with more variation between carriers. The weight regulations were the most persistent, surviving in modified forms into the 1980s at some airlines, contested and relitigated repeatedly in a legal environment that found them discriminatory in principle but was uncertain about the remedy. The change was real. It was also slow, uneven, and achieved at significant personal cost by the women who fought for it. They won. It took longer than it should have. Some flight attendants didn't leave when the rules told them to. Some fought the marriage ban and kept their jobs anyway. Some challenged the weight policies and won. Some simply hid what they needed to hide and continued doing the work they were good at and had built their lives around. These women, the ones who stayed past 30, past marriage, past the airline's preferred expiration date, quietly redefined what the job could look like. They became the senior crew members who trained the next generation, the union representatives who argued for better conditions, the institutional memory of an industry that had spent decades pretending they didn't exist. Their persistence was not glamorous, but it changed things. The women who stayed past the rules did so through a combination of legal action, strategic concealment, and the specific stubbornness of people who have decided that the institution does not get to define the limits of their professional life. Some filed grievances and fought them through the union process. Some hired lawyers. Some appealed termination decisions and won reinstatement, returning to the job after months or years away, with back pay negotiated and the airline's lawyers having spent significant resources trying to prevent it. The reinstatement cases were particularly important because they established that the terminations had been wrongful, that the policies underpinning them were illegal, which created the precedents that protected the women who came after. The women who stayed through concealment paid a different kind of cost. Maintaining a hidden marriage across a working life is an exercise in sustained vigilance that most people would find exhausting after a month. You managed your paperwork carefully. You kept your personal life compartmentalized from your professional one. You chose your confidants with precision, understanding that the wrong person knowing the wrong thing could end the career you had spent years building. Some women maintained these concealed marriages for 5, 7, 10 years. The entirety of what the airline imagined was a career, exceeded and continued past every checkpoint where the system expected them to disappear. What these women built, in staying, was something the industry had not anticipated: a senior workforce. Women who had been in the job for 10, 15 years developed expertise that was not replicable in a 6-week training program. They knew the routes in their bodies. They knew the passengers by type and by specific frequent flyer idiosyncrasy. They knew the galley equipment, the aircraft systems, the emergency protocols in the specific, embodied way that only comes from having applied them repeatedly. They knew which supervisors to approach with which problems and which colleagues to trust. This knowledge, the accumulated institutional knowledge of experienced professionals, was exactly what the airline's policy of mandatory early retirement had been systematically destroying, one career at a time. The women who stayed past the system's preferred endpoint did not receive formal acknowledgement of what they had preserved, but they shaped the industry that came after them in ways that are traceable, if not always credited. The flight attendant workforce of the 1970s and 80s, older, more diverse, more legally protected, more organized, was built on the foundation that the women who refused to leave had maintained through the previous decade. They had kept the door open, barely, for everyone who walked through it after. The women who worked as flight attendants in the 1960s left behind something more durable than the rules that governed them. They left a profession transformed. The flight attendants who came after them operated under contracts that protected their weight, their marital status, their age, their right to be pregnant and employed simultaneously, protections that exist precisely because the women of the 60s fought for them in courtrooms and union halls and EEOC offices, while also managing meal carts and emergency exits, and the smiles that were never optional. Modern cabin crew work conditions are imperfect, but they are categorically different from what they were, and the distance between then and now is measured in the choices that real women made under real pressure when it would have been easier to simply accept the rules as written. The legal protections that exist today in the airline industry, and more broadly, across service industries, across workplaces, across the employment relationship in general, did not arrive fully formed from the legislature. They were built case by case, grievance by grievance, by women who understood that a rule applied to them on the basis of their sex was a rule that needed to be challenged, even when the challenge was slow, even when the odds were uncertain, even when the personal cost of fighting was higher than the personal cost of compliance. The flight attendants of the 1960s were not unique in this understanding, but they were organized, they were visible, and they worked in an industry that was sufficiently glamorized that their cases attracted attention that cases from less celebrated industries sometimes did not. The contribution to the broader women's rights movement of this era is not always fully acknowledged in the histories that focus on the more dramatic moments, the marches, the demonstrations, the legislative battles. But the steady, grinding, legal work done by flight attendant unions and their members in this period was consequential. The rulings that dismantled the marriage ban and the age limits established precedents that extended beyond the airline cabin. They contributed to a legal landscape in which employment discrimination on the basis of sex was increasingly indefensible, and they did so through the specific, documented, irrefutable evidence of what had been done to real women in a real workplace over a real period of time. What the 1960s flight attendant also left behind is harder to quantify but no less real. A model of professional competence under conditions designed to obscure it. These women managed safety emergencies, language barriers, medical crises, and the full range of human difficulty at altitude, while simultaneously operating under a regulatory environment that insisted their primary value was their appearance and their age. They did both. They did the job the training had built them for, and they did the performance the industry required of them, and they did it for years, in some cases for decades, without the institutional acknowledgement that either part of it deserved. The image of the 1960s stewardess has outlasted the era that produced it. It appears in costume, in nostalgia, in the specific cultural shorthand for a glamour that is understood to be of its time. What is less visible in that image, and what is worth making visible, is what it cost to produce it, and what the women who produced it did with the experience once they had it. They changed the industry. They changed the law. They changed what was possible for the women who came after them. They did it in heels and a girdle, with the approved shade of lipstick, smiling. They did it anyway. And that, in the end, is the story. Inside the airline industry of the 1960s, seniority was the closest thing to currency that a flight attendant could accumulate. It determined your routes, your scheduling, your days off, your layover cities, and the quality of your working life in ways that were both official and deeply personal. Senior crew members bid for the routes they wanted and, more often than not, got them. Junior crew members took what was left. And what was left, particularly in your first year or two, was the kind of schedule that seemed designed by someone who had never needed to sleep. Red-eye flights, holiday departures, the routes nobody else wanted, to the cities nobody particularly needed to visit in February. You didn't complain. Complaining was not a recognized part of the bidding process. The bidding system itself was administered through the union contract and was, in principle, transparent and fair. Seniority was seniority, the list was the list, and everyone knew where they stood on it. In practice, the experience of being at the bottom of that list was a specific kind of initiation that the senior crew members who had survived it regarded, with a mixture of sympathy and the mild satisfaction of people who have paid dues and are now watching someone else pay them. You were new, the The schedule reflected that. This was considered appropriate. What the seniority system created, over time, was a workforce stratified by experience in ways that were sometimes invisible from the outside. The senior flight attendant working the premium transatlantic route in first class was not a different job category from the junior crew member working the domestic red-eye to a regional airport. They held the same title, wore the same uniform, and were assessed against the same appearance standards at the same pre-flight inspection. But their working lives were substantially different in the quality of the passenger interaction, in the length and destination of the layover, in the hours of the departure, in the cumulative physical toll of the schedule. Seniority was experience made visible in the schedule, and the schedule told you, without ambiguity, exactly where you stood. Junior crew members in their first years described the scheduling as the most difficult aspect of the job, harder than the difficult passengers, harder than the long flights, harder than the pre-flight inspections. The irregularity of the early schedule made everything else harder. Sleep deprivation is not a condition that improves your ability to maintain the smile, to manage the emotional labor, to conduct the briefing with the clarity and authority the training had emphasized. You did it anyway, because the schedule was the schedule and the job required the job. But the first years were a particular kind of difficult that the advertising had not mentioned and the training had not fully prepared you for. The bidding system also meant that the women who had fought to stay in the industry past the age limits and the marriage ban, who had won their legal battles and returned to the workforce, found themselves, upon reinstatement, at the bottom of the seniority list again. Years of accumulated standing gone. The red-eye to a regional airport in February, available again. Some airlines attempted to reinstate seniority along with employment, following legal rulings. Others did not, and the question of seniority restoration became its own separate legal argument in cases that had already been argued once. The women who had won the right to return to work sometimes had to fight a second time just to return to the position they had held before the wrongful termination. The industry did not make it easy. It rarely did, but the list moved, slowly, upward, one flight at a time. The regulations governing flight attendants in the 1960s were not written in the language of discrimination. They were written in the language of professionalism, standards, brand consistency, and passenger experience. The policy documents that authorized weight checks and marriage bans and mandatory retirement ages used words like requirements, qualifications, and the nature of the position, language that placed the rules inside a framework of legitimate occupational necessity rather than the framework of systematic exclusion that they actually represented. Reading the policy documents without the context of who they were applied to and how, you might conclude that they described a reasonable, if demanding, professional environment. Reading them with that context, you conclude something else entirely. The framing was deliberate. Airlines in this era had legal departments that understood, at least in outline, that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 had changed the landscape of employment law. The response was not to abandon the policies, but to defend them, to construct arguments for their legitimacy that would hold up under scrutiny. The weight requirement was framed as a safety standard. A flight attendant who exceeded the weight limit could not, the argument went, perform the physical requirements of the role. The age limit was framed similarly. The physical demands of the job were best met by younger workers. The marriage ban was framed as a scheduling necessity. Married women had domestic obligations that interfered with the irregular demands of a flight crew schedule. None of these arguments were entirely without a surface logic, which was precisely the point. A surface logic is durable enough to survive the first round of scrutiny, to occupy the time and resources of the lawyers and commission staff on the other side, to generate the delays and appeals and counter-arguments that made the legal dismantling of the rules so slow. You did not need an airtight argument. You needed an argument plausible enough to be argued, and the policy language had been written to supply exactly that. The gap between the policy language and the operational reality was significant. The weight requirement was framed as a safety standard, but it was applied to aesthetic outcomes, the approved silhouette, the fitted uniform, the visual product being delivered to the passenger. The age limit was framed as a physical capacity standard, but it removed experienced crew members at precisely the age when their experience was most valuable, replacing them with younger women whose physical youth was the actual qualification being sought. The marriage ban was framed as a scheduling necessity, but it applied regardless of the schedule. A married woman with a flexible schedule and no domestic constraints was dismissed under the same policy as a woman with every conceivable conflict. The framing was the frame. The picture inside it was something else. What the policy language accomplished, beyond its legal function, was the normalization of the rules for the people administering them. A supervisor who was conducting a weigh-in under a policy described as a safety standard was not, in her own understanding, doing something that required examination. She was enforcing a professional requirement, the same way any supervisor in any industry enforces professional requirements. The language had done its work. It had placed the action inside a category of ordinary professional administration, where it would not be examined too closely by the people whose daily job was to carry it out. Language does this. It has always done this, and the people who wrote these particular policies understood that very well. The 1960s were the decade in which commercial aviation transformed from a specialized mode of travel for the prosperous into something approaching a mass phenomenon, and the technology driving that transformation changed the physical environment of the flight attendant's working life in ways that were simultaneously remarkable and entirely unacknowledged in the job description. The introduction of the jet aircraft, specifically the Boeing 707 and the Douglas DC-8 at the dawn of the decade, followed by the wide-body jets that began arriving at its close, changed the size of the aircraft, the speed of the journey, the number of passengers in the cabin, and the scale of the service operation that cabin crew were expected to manage. More seats meant more passengers. More passengers meant more meal trays, more drink orders, more call buttons, more of everything. The staffing ratios improved incrementally. The job got bigger faster. The pressurized jet cabin was a different environment from the propeller aircraft that had preceded it. Cruising altitude was higher, which meant the cabin pressure differential was greater, which meant the physical effects of the working environment on the crew were more pronounced. Prolonged exposure to pressurized cabin air is dehydrating in ways that are cumulative across a working life. The skin, the sinuses, the joints, all register it eventually. Crew members who worked long international routes on jet aircraft in this era were spending significant portions of their careers in an environment that their bodies were not designed to inhabit, and the physical toll of that accumulated gradually, and without the industry's particular attention. The galley equipment changed with the aircraft. Jet-era galleys were more sophisticated than their propeller-era predecessors, with better ovens and more organized cart systems. They were also more complex to operate, with equipment failures that required troubleshooting under time pressure in a space that had not expanded to accommodate the increased complexity. The meal service on a full wide-body jet with 300 passengers was a logistical operation of a different order from the meal service on a narrow-body aircraft with 100. The training adapted, incrementally. The smile requirement did not. What the jet age also brought was a different passenger. Air travel in the early 1960s was still sufficiently expensive to select for a relatively narrow demographic: business travelers and the affluent leisure traveler. As the decade progressed and fares declined in response to greater capacity and competition, the passenger profile broadened. Families flew. Tourists flew. People who had never been on an aircraft before flew, and first-time flyers brought their own specific set of anxieties, behaviors, and needs to the cabin. The flight attendant of the late 1960s was managing a more varied and in some ways more demanding passenger environment than her counterpart at the decade's opening, with the same smile requirement and a galley that had gotten larger but not proportionally easier. The wide-body jets arriving at the end of the decade, the Boeing 747 began commercial service in 1969, represented a scale shift that was genuinely startling. A full 747 carried more than 400 passengers. The crew required to service it was larger, the coordination more complex, the logistics more demanding. The aircraft was a different kind of workplace, and it required a different kind of operational thinking from the people who ran its cabin. The women who adapted to it brought with them the training, the experience, and the institutional knowledge of a decade of jet-age flying. They adapted because adapting was the job, as it had always been the job, at whatever altitude and in whatever aircraft the industry decided to put them in next. For every flight attendant who fought the system and won, who filed the complaint and received the ruling, who stayed past the marriage ban and rebuilt her seniority, there were women who didn't make it through. Women who were weighed on a Thursday morning and sent home and never came back. Women who received the termination letter after their pregnancy was discovered and absorbed the loss quietly without legal challenge because they didn't know they had grounds for one, or because they couldn't afford the fight, or because the culture of the industry had been so effective at presenting the rules as reasonable that they had not yet understood them as wrong. These women are harder to find in the historical record because the historical record tends to preserve the stories of people who contested what happened to them, not the stories of people who absorbed it. The women who left quietly left for a variety of reasons, and not all of those reasons were entirely about the rules. Some left because the schedule was incompatible with the life they wanted to build, and the rules had simply accelerated a departure that was coming anyway. Some left because the physical demands of the job were genuinely significant, and the regulatory environment had made those demands harder to sustain. Some left because they had always understood the job as a window, a few years of travel and independence before the next stage of life, and they stepped through that window on their own terms, more or less, and did not experience the leaving as a loss. But some left because they were made to leave, and the making was not gentle, and the impact was not short-lived. A woman who had built her professional identity around a career, who had invested years in developing expertise, who had found in the community of the job something that her life outside it didn't offer. That woman, dismissed at 31 for the crime of having had a birthday, or dismissed at 26 for the crime of having married, lost something that the policy document did not acknowledge as a loss at all. The document recorded a termination. What the termination meant to the person receiving it was not part of the administrative record. The women who were dismissed under discriminatory policies and did not challenge those dismissals built their subsequent lives in the space available to them, which was often narrower than the space they had occupied in the job. Some found equivalent independence through other paths. Some did not. Some spent the following decades watching the industry they had been removed from change, the marriage bans dissolving, the age limits falling, the weight regulations being challenged, and processed whatever feeling that produced in whatever way they had available to them. Some felt vindicated. Some felt something more complicated. Some had moved far enough past it that the news registered as history rather than grievance. All of those responses are legitimate, and none of them have been adequately documented. The history of this era in the airline industry is told, appropriately, through the stories of the women who fought and won. Those stories are important. They explain how the change happened and who made it happen, and they deserve the prominence they have received. But they are not the whole history. The whole history includes the women who were lost quietly, who were weighed and dismissed and did not appear in the EEOC records, or the union archives, or the newspaper articles about the legal battles. They were part of this story too, the cost of it, the human accounting of what the rules actually meant when applied to actual lives. They deserve to be remembered, even when their names are not available for the remembering. And so, here you are. You've made it through the whole flight, the weigh-ins and the white glove inspections, the approved shade of coral lipstick and the girdle touch checks, the marriage bans and the age limits, and the smile that was never ever optional. You've spent this journey in the company of women who got up every morning, put on their regulation heels, pinned their regulation hair, and walked into a system that had very specific opinions about every inch of them, and went to work anyway. It would be easy to look back at the 1960s airline industry and feel only the absurdity of it. The ankle measurements, the scales before dawn, the supervisors with clipboards and opinions about your undergarments. There is genuine absurdity there, and we have not looked away from it. But beneath the absurdity is something else. something that deserves a quieter kind of attention before you drift off tonight. These women were competent, deeply, seriously, professionally competent. They memorized evacuation procedures and administered first aid at altitude and managed the specific controlled chaos of a full cabin in turbulence. And they did all of it while maintaining a standard of appearance and warmth and emotional availability that most workplaces would never dare to require. They were doing two jobs simultaneously, the visible one and the invisible one, and they were doing both of them well, in an era that only officially acknowledged one. And when the rules became too much to absorb, when the absurdity hardened into something that felt more like injustice, which it was, they organized, they filed complaints, they gave depositions. They sat in waiting rooms outside EEOC offices and waited for rulings that took years to arrive. They did this while also working the job, while also managing the smile, while also showing up to the pre-flight inspection in the approved shade of lipstick. They changed the law from inside a system that was using that same law to diminish them. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, an enormous thing, done quietly, over years by women whose names most of us have never learned. So tonight, as you settle into whatever softness surrounds you, your pillow at the exact angle you prefer, your blanket at the weight that feels right, your room at the temperature nobody else has approved or regulated or weighed you against, maybe hold for just a moment the thought of a woman at 30,000 feet in 1963. She is wearing heels on a wet tarmac. Her lipstick is fresh. Her hair has not moved since 6 this morning. She has just served 200 people their dinner and answered 14 call buttons and managed one passenger who needed more than a drink and a redirect. And she has done all of it with an expression that gives nothing away. She is tired in a way the advertising never showed. She is also, in ways the advertising couldn't capture, something remarkable, resilient, skilled, clear-eyed about the system she is operating inside, and quietly determined to outlast it. She did outlast it. They all did, in one way or another. And the world they left behind, the contracts, the protections, the legal precedents, the simple fact that a woman can now work an aircraft cabin past the age of 32 without it being considered a violation of policy, that world was built by their refusal to simply accept what they had been handed. History may have dressed them in pillbox hats and given them clipboards full of rules they didn't write, but they rewrote them anyway. Sleep well tonight. You've earned it, and so did they.